We're here at the ITU studio in Geneva, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Robert E. Kahn, who has just been awarded the ITU 150 Award on May 17th, 2015, which is the anniversary of the ITU, 150th anniversary of the ITU. And Dr. Kahn, thank you very much indeed for being with us today.
My pleasure.
I'd like to start off by talking about you have played a pioneering role in the development in the internet. You laid the foundations of the TCP IP protocol architecture, a standard operating feature of the internet, and you've continued to nurture its evolution, steering the development of new standards. You also developed the concept of digital object architecture, DOA, which provides the framework for interoperability and heterogeneous information systems. You've been quoted as saying that most people thought that connecting computers was an unnecessary task in the 1960s when you first started working on the project. What was the motivation behind it?
Well, first, let me say that the internet has been an activity that's involved hundreds, thousands, perhaps even more people around the globe. And the protocols I developed with a colleague of mine named Ben Cerf, this is something I've been working on ever since, so is he, and so is so many other people and organizations around the globe. But to the point of your question, if you put yourself back in the time frame when we first started connecting computers, which was in the 1960s, some 50, almost 50 years ago now, most of the computers that existed were large batch machines, what were called mainframe machines at the time. And they really didn't have an ability to interact with others, so there was no point of trying to connect them. Besides, it would have been a loss of business for those computer centers that was satisfying their local constituencies. On the other hand, time-sharing systems had recently emerged, and there were a number, probably several dozen if not more, in the very largest of organizations and the research community, mainly funded by government. And the question really came up on the part of many people, well, if you could link them, you know, what kind of things could you do? Well, you might be able to, for example, move programs around. At that time, programs were generally done in machine language. There were very few high-level language programs as we now see them, maybe Fortran programs, things like that. But if a program was written for one machine in one computing environment, it was hard to port it somewhere else at that time. And so you could go over the net and run it there. You could have programs interact with programs to do possibly interesting things. These were research challenges. As a practical matter, once we built the net, we didn't solve those problems instantly, and for the most part, they're still unsolved today. So it's still a pioneering challenge for the future. But we did a number of things that were really interesting, like we as part of the organization that I was with at the time called DARPA, we actually pioneered. Well, actually, a few years before I joined them, they started a program to build what was then the world's first real supercomputer. It was called ILIAC-4, and that was a machine that was built in a version of 1. And so the question was, how do we make that available to the community? Well, a network was the obvious answer.
Did you ever imagine how networks of computers would evolve to become such a central part of society and development?
Well, I have a serious answer to that, and I have a non-serious answer. The serious one, of course, is that this was just a research experiment, and we were just, as scientists, trying to figure out how would you make computers talk to computers? What kind of networks would be efficient for carrying this kind of short, bursty traffic? It was really not commensurate with the use of this telephone system, which might have taken 10 or 20 seconds to set up a call, where you only had a tiny bit of information to send that might take a few milliseconds. So packet switching was one of the outgrowths of that. And little by little, over time, we could see its increased relevance, especially when the carriers saw that packet switching was a good alternative for building their own networks, and they then later became an integral part of the internet. But the frivolous answer to that, the less serious one, is of course we could see it all back then. We knew with precision when the personal computer would be invented, when government networks would be open to the public. We knew when you'd have multiple carriers competing, and that's a fun answer I like to give, for which the question coming back is really.
But of course, it's difficult to predict. But it's just incredible how the proliferation of from a small project, it's really taken over the world.
I gave a lecture at the National Academy of Engineering in Washington a number of years ago, maybe 20, and it was one of these talent searches where they have the best young kids coming up with their ideas and vying for first prize, and one young lady asked me a question at the time, which makes sense for a 15-year-old. How did we get permission from all the governments of the world to build the internet? And of course I had to explain to her that this was something they didn't think was really going anywhere, and so they pretty much gave us free running room, thinking it would not really lead to anything.
You were under the radar. And can I ask you, what do you want to see as the next steps for the internet?
Well, I think the idea of computers talking to computers is pretty much a universal one. I think that's going to exist as long as we have computers. And in fact, that whole field is burgeoning. I mean, today, while there might be a few billion devices or individuals connected to the network, to the internet as a whole, we're looking at 50 or 100 billion things connected in the so-called Internet of Things. Well, really, the very first networks were connecting things. They were called big computers. So this is just a logical extension of that going forward. But for me, the biggest challenge has been the use of the network capabilities for managing information. That's what I've been spending most of my time on. And the Internet of Things is really about managing information about the things more than it is about managing the things themselves, because all you can really do is find out, is your oven on, is your oven off, is the temperature high, is the temperature low, and then maybe you can take action to affect it somehow or other. But it's managing the information that's really important, and we've had very few serious efforts on being able to manage information over the long term.
Finally, ITU today is publicly recognizing your vital contribution to the world of ICTs. I just wanted to ask you how you felt about that, what that meant to you.
Well, it's always great when your peers recognize you and when institutions recognize you. And the ITU, I mean, for 150 years, that's a very long time for an institution. So they're obviously doing something that really is relevant to society at large. I know they do multiple things, but to be recognized by an institution like that and by its leadership is very meaningful to me, and I think it's a great feeling.
Dr. Kant, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
Great to see you again. Thank you.
Bye-bye.